Today, we will talk about Cuba. The reason is that in 2026, from Venezuela to the Middle East, there are extremely large-scale upheavals affecting the entire world, and a big question is being raised. What will the United States do next with Cuba? On the world map, Cuba lies right next to the United States, with a geographical distance of only about 150 kilometers. This is an extremely sensitive position, enough to directly affect U.S. security. The history between the two countries is a long chain of hatred, overthrow, and military confrontation. To understand why the current situation is so tense, we need to look back at history. And the following content has been compiled and collected from many different sources on the internet. So if there is any incorrect information, please comment below so we can discuss it together. Let's begin. When the United States stepped in to support Cuba in gaining independence from Spain, after achieving its objective, the U.S. did not withdraw, but stayed and exerted influence, forcing Cuba to accept many binding conditions. At that time, Cuba was only independent in name, while the United States remained and even kept the Guantanamo base until now. To better understand the Guantanamo military base, it is a land area of about 116 square kilometers, located at Guantanamo Bay in the southeast of Cuba, near the city of Guantanamo, facing the Caribbean Sea, with a strategic position controlling maritime routes in the region. The United States leased this land from Cuba in 1903 after the Spanish-American War and has maintained it until today. But Cuba does not recognize the legality of this lease agreement. This nominal independence lasted for decades, causing increasing frustration among the Cuban people. By 1959, Fidel Castro led a revolution that overthrew the old government. After taking power, the new government began reclaiming assets, land, and factories that had belonged to American corporations. This event caused the United States to completely lose control, and from then on, the two sides officially entered a period of uncompromising confrontation. In 1961, a group of Cuban exiles returned with a failed plan to overthrow the government, becoming a humiliation for the United States. Immediately afterward, the U.S. shifted to economic sanctions. No trade, no cooperation, with the goal of exhausting Cuba's economy. In response, Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union. The peak came in 1962, when the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. From that point on, Cuba was no longer a small country in the eyes of the United States, but a thorn right at its side. To deal with Cuba, the United States has used economic pressure, specifically imposing an embargo from 1962 to the present, restricting tourism, limiting remittances from abroad into Cuba, exerting internal pressure by inciting the population, supporting opposition groups, and indirect blockades. Simply put, if you don't play with me, I won't let you play with others either. In that situation, Cuba also made preparations. In terms of defense, they built a militia system of up to 4 million people, dug thousands of kilometers of tunnels, and established more than 1,400 independent defensive zones so that if war broke out, U.S. forces would become bogged down. In foreign relations, Cuba drew Russia and China as a, quote, protective umbrella. Russia provides financial support, oil, and deploys warships and submarines to Havana. China provides intelligence, technology, funding, and invests in solar energy so Cuba can sustain its own energy supply. Economically, since 2021, Cuba has begun licensing private enterprises to compensate for shortages of goods, allowing farmers to borrow idle land to cultivate crops even within cities to ensure food security. Despite economic exhaustion, the state still maintains free healthcare and education benefits to retain public support. So, why is Cuba a focal point in 2026? In the current situation, the United States is facing greater pressure than ever. Washington's biggest goal is to compete with China. However, the U.S. cannot both focus on China and be drawn into too many military hotspots. Therefore, the U.S. needs to clean up its backyard, including Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba, to reduce pressure and concentrate resources on larger strategic objectives. That is why the United States must pay special attention to Cuba for the following reasons. First, security. If adversaries place bases or surveillance systems in Cuba, it is like placing them right in front of the U.S. doorstep, which is extremely dangerous, so the U.S. cannot accept it. Second, migration. The more difficult Cuba's economy becomes, the greater the migration wave, creating pressure on U.S. borders. Third, elections. With millions of people of Cuban origin concentrated in Florida, a key swing state in elections, taking a hard stance on Cuba is a way for the U.S. administration to leverage those who oppose the current Cuban regime to accumulate votes. Fourth, regional alliances. Cuba has close relations with Venezuela and Nicaragua, countries not aligned with the U.S., which could directly affect the U.S. if conflict occurs. From all these factors, if viewed purely from a geopolitical perspective, Cuba is no longer just a simple tourist island, but an unsinkable aircraft carrier located right at the doorstep of the United States. The 150-kilometer distance is a haunting figure in every security map at the Pentagon. The danger of Cuba does not lie in direct military strength, but in its backdoor position. Any presence of rival great powers, such as Russia or China, here would mean the United States is placed in a situation of being monitored right in its own living room. A radar system, a high-tech listening station, or a visit by a nuclear submarine in Havana is enough to create a security gap that is difficult for Washington to fill, forcing the U.S. to always pay special attention to this area as a reflex of self-preservation. Under the administration of Trump in 2026, the approach toward Cuba is expected not to be conciliatory or accommodating. Instead, it will be a pragmatic game with maximum pressure intensity. The tightening the noose economic strategy. Trump tends to prioritize economic sanctions over costly military intervention. The United States will increase financial sanctions targeting any entity, including international companies, doing business with Cuba. The goal is to squeeze Cuba's foreign currency and fuel supply to force internal change. Border management and the Florida vote. Policy toward Cuba will be closely tied to border security and immigration control. Preventing migration waves will be the perfect justification for the U.S. to intensify patrols and tighten control over the waters surrounding Cuba. Countering the influence of major rivals. The U.S. will firmly prevent cooperation between Cuba and Russia or China. Washington may offer economic incentives or threaten sanctions against third countries if they continue to invest in infrastructure or deploy military assets in Cuba. Trump will present a harsh choice to global partners. Do business with the U.S. or choose Cuba. In summary, Cuba continues to be trapped in the vortex of geopolitics between a superpower seeking to lock down its front door and a small nation striving to survive at all costs. And the world will certainly witness another nerve-wracking and tense moment. What do you think about this geopolitical game between the United States, Cuba, and the major powers? Leave your comments below.